Hi, my name is Rika Uxnes, and welcome to this Tech Talk on AI and fraud. Fraud is a major societal problem where criminals get away with millions of euros each year in the Nordics. An increase in data available on individuals together with technological advancements make us vulnerable. The rapid advancements in AI has made it possible to impersonate people. To illustrate this, we are using a deepfake of Rikke to give this introduction. Suomessa rikolliset huijasivat suomalaisilta 44 miljoonaa euroa vuonna 2023. Vaalepoliisihuijaukset ja tietojen kalastelu olivat suurimpia petoksia. I Sverige utfördes bedrägeribrott till 5,8 miljarder kronor, vilket var en ökning med 67% från föregående år. I Danmark lykkedes det banker at stoppe omkring 60% af svindelforsøg. How can banks prevent fraud in an era where deception through AI is easily available? Today we've gathered industry experts to discuss how advancement in AI impact fraud in the Nordics. With me in the studio, I have Sebastian Clayton Takle, Department Head of Financial Cyber Crime Center at DNB.
Thank you.
And participating virtually, we have Chris Hubbard, Head of Fraud, Anti-Bribery and Corruption, and Tax Evasion at Danske Bank. We have Antti Alisalo, who's AFC Specialist in Fraud Management at OP. And we have Rasmus Beyer, Partner and Head of FinCrime at Deloitte in Denmark. I want to kick things off by asking you, Rasmus, from a market perspective, how do you see advancements in AI impacting fraud in the Nordics and globally?
Thanks, Rikke. Yes, and as your AI deepfake just mentioned, this is a major issue across the Nordics. But yeah, looking outside the Nordics, obviously various reports coming in at the moment from ACFE and other reports, including our own, surely indicates that, well, fraud is on the rise. Speaking from my perspective, to the Danish police, it's been clear that the fraud case has been fairly stable for the last few years. We have a national police focusing on AI-related fraud. But speaking to them lately, it's also clear that is now on the rise. I think from a Nordic perspective, we have been a bit lucky over some years that our language barriers has prevented some of the typical fraud schemes. With AI coming in, is my perception at least that we're going to see an increase in that because the language barriers are going to be much less. So it's clearly an issue. It's my impression at the moment that we are 2 steps behind the fraudsters. They work organized, they work borderless, and they had gone directly into using AI much faster than we have managed to do from our side, both from the industry, banks, and from public parts. So definitely, I think we are behind at the moment. It's a big society problem, not only towards vulnerable people, but also across age groups. We heard lately that also millennials, for instance, younger groups, are subject to investment fraud, for instance. So this is really, it's attacking our society in many ways, and I think we are behind as we stand now, and we need to look into the opportunities to use AI ourselves.
As you said, fraud is massively increasing in the Nordics, and Swedish police has also reported that criminal networks make twice as much from fraud than they do drugs. And in Finland, CEO fraud amounted to 5 million euros in 2022, and police and phishing scams about 10 million euros. So Antti, are we seeing AI impacting fraud trends, or is the worst yet to come?
Well, actually, in Finland, we haven't seen much AI being used in the scams now, although we do have a couple of example cases lately where the fraudster has created a WhatsApp account in the name of a CEO of a company with the profile picture copied from the company's websites and sending out a voice message to an employer that is responsible of the payments in the company, ordering to make a fraudulent payment. Those cases haven't been successful, so we are lucky for now to not have conceded any loss for customers in those cases. But in the near future, we do anticipate that the use of AI will increase related to the scams as the technology gets better day by day, and the use of AI gets easier for anyone out there to use. But on the other hand, in the phishing genre, we do have seen quite a lot of AI being used by the fraudsters in the automated processes that they are trying to get more efficient, and also we can see that the phishing messages have been of high quality lately compared to what they previously had been. So we suspect that there is AI being used very much in those messages. We also believe that the development and use of AI has been a major reason behind growth, massive growth in fraud, in phishing attacks in Finland last year. But in which fraud types we anticipate there will be especially a big growth in the near future are the scams related to social manipulation, such as the CEO frauds and investment scams, pub scams, all kinds of scams where there could be useful to impersonate someone's voice or use deepfake video. So unfortunately for Western, I have to answer that the worst is yet to come when it comes to the AI being used in the fraud.
Thank you, Antti. How do you see this, Sebastian?
I think this brings us over to a fairly important point when discussing AI and the use of it within fraud and the way criminal networks use technology, because I think I couldn't agree more with what was just said, and I think the point there is that criminals will use technology to increase their profit, right? And how do they do that? Well, they're going to need faster attacks. They're going to need attacks that hit more people. They're going to need attacks that have fewer red flags that are easy to identify. And within these areas, right, we're going to see the rise of, amongst other things, AI as one of the tools they use. But I think at the same time, it's that we have a tendency to want to discuss very exciting things like the introduction we had here today, when the reality is that increasing their profits doesn't come from using very, advanced or at least not very exciting technology, because, some of these criminal environments have been using AI for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years to some extent or another, and they've been doing it by, creating fake profile pictures, by using artificial text generation, fairly sort of simple things that aren't necessarily very fun to talk about. But that when you're running a phishing campaign, for example, if you can, suddenly attack 10 times as many people as you did yesterday, you can do it with a 20% better sort of language quality, meaning that the red flags go down, and you can maybe automate, a quick sort of call and response to just filter out those that obviously aren't going to fall for this response. Then what that sort of turns out to on their end is a massive increase in profit. But from our end, it doesn't necessarily look like AI. It can be simple automation or the use of other sort of technology. But what we're seeing is it's the simple things. It's the improving the cumbersome parts of their operations. That's where the money is going to lie for a lot of these criminal operations.
So are we too focused on the sensational deepfake cases like the Hong Kong one where employee was frauded of 25 million after a deepfake video conference call with the CFO?
I think what we definitely can say is that I had 10,000 registered fraud cases in DNB last year that FC3 handled, and the amount of time we spend discussing, for example, deepfakes compared to the impact it had last year on the fraud landscape is completely out of proportion. Right now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be using time talking about it, because we need to be prepared for what's to come, and we also need to realize that even if we didn't see a lot of deepfakes being used, AI and automation was definitely used by the threat actors and had a massive increase. I mean, I couldn't agree more with what was said about the phishing attacks there. We've seen a 1,000% rise over the last few years in the amount of people that have fallen for phishing attacks. This hasn't happened by coincidence. It's happened because, the criminals have got new tools they can use. But at the same time, we do have a tendency to want to talk about the very fun parts of it and not necessarily talk as much about the boring parts, like text generation. This has been important for them.
think that's a really interesting point and brings us nicely over also to how can banks prepare for these advancements? What are the actual risks we're looking for? And I wanted to ask you, Chris, first, because in Denmark, banks managed to stop about 60% of fraud attacks. But what is the bank's responsibility going forward? And are you, as in the banks, doing enough in this area?
Yeah, I think it's a good question to ask, and I think there's a couple of angles to come at that question. I think to begin with, kind of the stats question is interesting. So it's good that the region is starting to get better stats, better insight into the fraud that's happening. But we also know when it comes to scams that probably the majority of victims still don't report it. So a lot of that is going unreported. So the true scale of it is actually probably a lot bigger than what's being seen. And unless you can get that reported, it makes it more challenging to actually put those strategies in place to try and stop it. But the banks absolutely have a big responsibility in all of this, right? It's our customers that are being affected. We have a societal responsibility to play our part there. And so I think that's been happening for a long time. So I'd like to echo what the guys have said. This isn't necessarily something new for us. So if you look within most banks, I would say the fraud team is probably the most mature of the financial crime areas. So dependent on the size of the bank and where it is, they've probably been managing fraud for anywhere between 10 and 40 years, which is actually quite a long time. So there is a level of maturity there. I mean, they invest heavily in the variety of people and expertise that they need. The technology agenda is huge at the moment. There's loads of investment being pumped into that. You've also got a lot of focus on kind of more of the simple stuff as well. So we as a bank are out there quite a lot trying to educate customers, increase awareness around these kind of scams that are going on. So all of these, I think, have been strategies that we've deployed for probably the last 5 years or so. I think it's like the guys have mentioned, just the attack rate has increased. So it's getting more focused. So we're having to just do more of that and obviously look for cleverer ways of trying to stop these attacks. I think it's also important to say that if you look at one of these scam attacks, if you look at it as like a 24-hour period, it's probably in the last hour that the bank actually sees anything of what's going on. So all of these attacks are being developed, they're being manipulated across different types of social media, and that's where all the activity is taken to manipulate the customers and get them ready to actually take the money. And some of the stats that started to come out of the UK last year were really interesting. So TSB said that 80% of all of the scams that they'd seen against their customers originated on Meta platforms. So that's one company with all these scams where all the work is being done. And then kind of in the last hour, we have to try and do whatever we can to try and prevent that money going. And I think that's one of the big industry challenges that we should be spending a lot of time talking about.
Thank you, Chris. And how can banks prepare for the advancements further? So we're talking about we have controls in place, but what should we do to prepare further for advancements in AI? Sebastian?
Well, I think we need to do several things at once, which is what's always the answer. I think that AI, without a doubt, is going to be an important tool when it comes to combating fraud. But I think it's going to be exactly that. It's going to be a tool, right? So for me, AI is a hammer. Is a hammer useful? Yes, a hammer is extremely useful. But it's just one of the tools I have in my toolbox. Do I think it's going to change the whole landscape? Yeah, it very well may. That's very possible. But it's still only going to be one of the aspects we need to keep an eye on. And I know that a lot of people seem to be of the opinion that AI probably could, come in and take over, for example, the whole, fraud detection thing. And I think my point to that would be that if we look at the big changes that have happened on the tech side over the past few decades, right? If we look at the rise of big data, if we look at the rise of, practical automation and things like that, these have all been things that are now extremely useful parts of our toolbox, but they haven't taken over. And the reason for that is because theoretically what they're capable of is not necessarily what they're practically able to be used for. So practical implementation of this technology isn't necessarily as easy as we think, even if we can see the theoretical advantages to it. So I would say that we need to keep having these discussions. We're in an arms race with criminal organizations at the moment, where automation and technology is one of the places this arms race is taking place. We definitely need to maintain our position in that arms race, because if you end up falling behind, you're going to have a big problem. But if we spend too much time talking about new tech and how it can be used, we need to make sure that we're at the same time spending our time looking at what's actually going on at the moment. Because if we don't, then while we're talking about what can happen in the future, the criminals are going to end up running away with an awful lot of money, which is a situation we don't want.
And if we look at what's going on at the moment, do we currently have good enough controls in place?
I think answering yes to having good enough controls in place is probably a scary thing to do. But I would say that from my perspective, we're in a very good position at the moment. We're stopping sort of 70 to 80% of the attacks we're seeing. We had an attack sum in DNB of 1.8 billion last year, where we stopped 1.5 of them. Would I rather have stopped 1.8? Obviously. Is that ever going to happen? No, it's not. And that's because we need to accept the fact that we're handling dynamic threat actors, right? This isn't a static threat that you can measure, evaluate, and then put in place countermeasures, because as soon as you do that, then the threat changes and it tries to adapt to your countermeasures. So I think that, yes, we're in a good place. Yes, we need to keep talking about all of the avenues we can in order to improve things, in the years to come. Tech and AI is going to be one of them. I would say that cooperation with police and law enforcement and other public sector organizations is going to be a central part in this. I would say that cooperation between financial institutions is one of the main areas where you can be able to keep an eye on this threat. Although in the Nordics, that's something we are very, very good at. There is a very good working relationship between the financial institutions. But you need to sort of keep all of these avenues open if you want to be able to handle this threat in the years to come, because it's not going to be solved. I don't care what people say. It's not going to be solved by a company that finds one AI software platform that we all use and then we don't have any problems anymore, because that's not how dynamic threat actors work. They will adapt to whatever we put in place.
Antti, how do you see that banks need to adapt going forward to deal with the threat of AI?
Well, firstly, I have to say wise words from Sebastian. I completely agree that we do need the so-called old school methods and add in the newcomers. And AI technology is obviously one of those that the banks need to concentrate on developing effective AI tools in the future more and more to combat the crimes. On a rough level, we can divide the frauds into two categories, where either the victim by him or herself is doing the fraudulent payment, or in the other case, the fraudsters have stolen the banking credentials and are making the payments in the victim's bank. To prevent the fraudulent payments more effectively in the first scenario, that the banks needs to use transaction-based generative AI models in the future that can analyze the transaction data much faster and with more precision than previously used tool. That way we can catch the new fraud and the fraud indicators in a much faster way, and then be more efficient in preventing the fraudulent transactions. In the second scenario, where the criminal is using the banking credentials of the victim and making the fraudulent payments, I think it would be good to be a new normal for banks to use behavior-based analytics and authentication to detect whether the real user is behind the credentials, using the credentials by himself, or if there is actually a fraudster using the fished or stolen credentials. Basically, the PBA technology allows the banks to make risk assessments depending on the user's physical behavior, such as using the mouse or the keyboard buttons, or even touching the screen of the device. And the PBA technology uses the generative AI to develop user profiles, and that can effectively detect behavior. So that way you see very easily if the if the credentials are being used by someone else than the real user. So I'm really bandwagon of the VBA technology in these terms.
And what capabilities would we require, and what are the prerequisites to be successful with leveraging AI for better fraud detection? Chris, if I may ask you.
Yeah, I think there's lots of things to consider. I think it's also worth pointing out, I think, before I go into the details, that banks have been using this for a while now. So certainly I find that the fraud areas can be the trailblazers with some of the new technology that's out there. So I know I've been working in roles for probably the last decade where we've been using machine learning. I think it started off with machine learning models that vendors would provide, but I'm starting to see in the last 5 years kind of banks building their own models using machine learning and AI. So the competencies do exist and I think are already there inside some of the banks. So it's a case of, I think, building on top of that. I think like Antti talked about, there's a lot of dependency on what goes into them. So they're just a tool to make the most of the information and the data that you've got available. So you need a depth, breadth, bringing in information from other areas in terms of what data is there that you can use within AI and within machine learning. So I think it depends a lot on the bank, I guess, how old it is, how new it is. If you're a brand new bank and you're on a shiny new platform, it's probably easier to ingest data from all parts of the bank, which is very good for profiling. If you're an older bank that's maybe come together as a part of lots of different banks consolidating, sometimes that's more of a challenge in terms of getting data into a standard format to be able to do those things. So there's a variety of things that need to be, I think, considered within that. But I do think the opportunities are there. You can bring kind of transactional data, which we've got lots of. If you look at something like e-commerce 3D secure transaction, there's hundreds of data points that could come through there. And then if you talk about the stuff on behavioral biometrics and plugging that in together, potentially activity that consumers are doing across other products that they have with a bank and other channels, that gives you a really good view of what's going on. And then if you can pull out other data, such as, is that customer on the phone to someone else while he's doing that activity, you've got some really good indicators that can help you make those decisions. And the AI capability allows you to process all of that information. It's also very good, especially when you start getting into unsupervised models, in picking up new trends. So you don't have to deploy lots and lots of people to help manage those models. They tend to look after themselves a lot better. And I think we're already in a good place there. There's some very good vendors that already do that kind of stuff. And like I say, in-house, some areas are starting to do that themselves too.
And do you see us running these models in parallel with existing models, or will they completely replace them?
I think, like some of the guys have said, that it's certainly not a silver bullet. I don't think it will replace things. Within fraud, it's all about having the kind of a layered approach and having multiple competencies. I think this is one of the things that you would use. But you'd like to think as the technology gets better, as the data availability increases, we can have more reliance on that technology to make our jobs easier. So we can then respond to that increase in attacks that was being mentioned, and also kind of focus ourselves on maybe what's coming in the future.
And Sebastian, what challenges do you see for leveraging AI in banks?
I think a lot of the points have been made very well here now. I would say that implementation of it is one thing. I think that to what extent we want to trust decision making is something that's going to have to evolve over time in organizations where we get to know technology and how much we can trust it and what we want to use it for. But there's no doubt that this is going to change, how we work in the same way as it changes the way criminals work. But I think we're a way away from it at the moment.
Antti, do you see any prerequisites for us to be successful with this?
Well, obviously there has to be a certain kind of what Chris was talking about, the data that can be able to use, and the architectural things. So and also, like Chris said, it can be easier for slightly banks or organizations than complicated multicultural organizations to implement these kind of technologies. But yeah, I think it depends on the case. What are the requirements to implement this? kind of technology.
Thank you. Want to round off with a round of reflections from the panel. Starting with you, Rasmus. What is the key advice to the industry for tackling this advancement in AI when it comes to fraud?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's been definitely some good reflections that I agree on. There's no silver bullet on it. But to talk about kind of what are some of the key elements, I think there's some good perspectives in terms of, I mean, even though we recognize that AI won't do everything, I think definitely getting on top of it, understanding what are the opportunities. I think you gave some good examples of where it can actually be used. Chris, as you say, a matter of basically utilizing your data in the proper way will open opportunities. And as you said, Sebastian, well, there's a number of other factors in it, public-private partnerships that can do a difference. I was at a conference yesterday in London, and I think some of the good input that came from one of the bigger banks joining there was basically saying, well, we recognize that we don't have a full strategy on how to apply AI in our fraud and fin crime area, but we are doing smaller steps in it. We're doing a little bit of a bottom-up approach whereby people who sits with the expert knowledge, they're basically allowed to maybe spend 15-20% of their time coming up with ideas where to apply AI. It can be small things, incremental things, and currently a lot of the POCs, when you look into AI application, tend to fail. Often it's because of data, but nevertheless it brings it forward incremental. And I think a part of another angle of looking at applying AI is maybe not only to detect the behavior, but it's also to make your current processes even more effective. If you manage to do so, if you, for example, manage to use AI to do your SAR reporting, we all know how much the SAR reporting takes up of time in an organization. If you take that angle on it and say, well, you can drive efficiency with AI, you can actually free up capacity to look deeper into new models and trends and get ahead of the curve. So I think AI in that sense can be used in a broader sense. And then to your point, Sebastian, on looking into public-private partnerships, and I think Chris, maybe you also mentioned kind of about the meta, that many things happens there. I think the more we can cross across industries and with public partnerships, I think the more also not only can we detect more. I think we have some very good use case by now that public partnerships can actually detect financial crime at an early point. But I think we can also be more disruptive towards the crime industry. As you said, Sebastian, it's the crime industry or the criminals. It's a big business. They're thinking of return on investment. Where can they improve their approach to society? So the more we can disrupt that and destroy it from the inside, I think the better. And I think as a society, we can do that by engaging into Facebook groups and letting them know we are there. And of course, that's maybe not the bank's responsibility, but that's within the police task. But the banks are part of that. I think the last point, maybe, I know we're sitting here with three large Nordic banks. I think that has a very solid procedures in place internally. I think from a broader perspective, when we look out from my view, being a consultant in the industry, not only for larger banks, but also maybe smaller banks or institutions in general, I think there's also something about making sure having the basic rights. I think we spoke indirectly about it, but actually understanding the risk of fraud in your organization is key. I think across the society, I see a number of improvement areas whereby actually understanding your fraud area, doing a proper fraud risk assessment, not only on external fraud, but also internal fraud. Do we know then how to, on the back of that, apply the necessary controls and using AI as part of that? Having that risk-based approach is something that we, if that get out to not only larger banks, but across society in a deeper sense, I think we will understand the threat more and can connect more properly on it.
And very quickly, just from Chris, Antti, and Sebastian, what is your best advice to people out there to not fall for fraud?
I think from my perspective, it's really difficult to give advice because some really smart people fall for fraud. So I think try and listen to the information that's out there. The banks do a lot of work in terms of trying to put that information out there for the good of the customers. If they can try and find the 10 seconds, the 20 seconds to read those pop-ups and just take that information in, at least that's a step in the right direction. But like I said, these fraudsters are so good, and AI is helping. Every little bit, I think, will be useful.
Antti, what about you?
Yeah, I agree completely with Chris. So it's on an individual level, the awareness about different kinds of frauds is the key factor to be able to detect them and not to be defrauded by the criminals. Of course, the banks and other sectors have to raise the awareness about the new kinds of fraud types, but in the end, it's always up to the individual, him or herself, to be careful and to stay safe in all environments. So a common tip maybe would be to always think twice and not to rush, evaluate the contact or opportunity if there's anything unusual about it, and usually when something sounds too good to be true, then it's too good to be true. So have to be careful, because the frauds are developing. There come new kinds of fraud types all the time. So you have to just have these basic elements in your own individual fraud detection, that you are being careful and trusting, giving your banking credentials into any sites where that you get a link from a message, something like. You have to think if it's really what it's saying to be. Is it really true message from the bank or authorities? So yeah, so basically just not to rush and be careful. Think twice in every situation that somebody orders you to do something with your bank credit.
What about you, Sebastian?
I would say that regardless of whether we're talking about public sector, private sector, or potential victims, the most important thing we can do is to keep an eye on the threat landscape and what's going on. So the threat landscape is giving us two signals now. One is keep an eye on AI. They're obviously using it and it's becoming important, and we can use it. And at the same time, over the last week, while I've been preparing for a talk about AI, we've seen an uptick locally in criminals that have dressed up as the police and have started showing up at home at the victim's place to defraud them, to take bank IDs, to take cards, and to take valuables. So what this shows us is that while I've been spending my week preparing for a high-tech talk, the criminals have gone low-tech on us, right, to a fairly high level. And that just let the threat landscape take you where it takes you. It's going to move us forward. It's going to move us forward in the direction of AI, but it's not only going to move us in that direction. It's going to move the criminals to where the money is and to where they can get hold of it, and we need to follow them there.
Excellent reflections. Thank you so much, Sebastian, Chris, Antti, and Rasmus, for sharing your insights. And thank you to those of you watching this Tech Talk on AI and fraud. If you have any questions, please reach out. And with that, stay vigilant of fraud attacks and have a great day. Thank you.